Welcome to the Friday edition of Juan's World, and I'm going to be a little bit biblical today, not in a theological sense, but still talking about the Bible as a way of continuing my sort of Christmas to Carnival to Easter theme, which I won't continue all the way to Easter, but I'll certainly include many things of this sort. I wanted to talk today specifically about the names of Jesus and of the apostles and of other people in the Greek Bible. We call it the Greek Bible so that we don't think of it as the New Testament versus the Old Testament, because the Old Testament are Jewish scriptures, and they certainly don't consider them to be old or outdated or whatever, and so to be even-handed, we call it the Greek Bible, because it was written in Greek. And unfortunately, not all of the people who wrote the parts of the Greek Bible that we know, certainly the author of the Gospel of Mark, were not very good at writing Greek. It wasn't their first language. By the time we get to John's Gospel, John spoke and wrote Greek perfectly well, and so did Paul. There are a great many people at that time who were Greek speakers because it was the lingua franca of a large part of the Middle East and Europe. And that's why the Gospels and Paul's letters were written in Greek, because they wanted as wide an audience as possible. Now here's the problem, if you want to call it that the names of people in the Greek Bible were not their names. They were Greek transliterations of their names, which were in the Aramaic language. Jesus and the apostles spoke Aramaic, and Paul did too. But Aramaic was a very localized language. It's actually still spoken by a very small number of people. It's the descendant of Hebrew. It's the kind of, street street Hebrew, if you like. And that's what Jesus spoke, and that's what everybody spoke. And when the Gospel writers got round to writing down the events of the life of Jesus, they had to transliterate the names from Aramaic into Greek. And here you've got a problem, because Greek doesn't have enough letters to translate or transliterate Hebrew sounds. For example, Greek does not have the sh sound. So anyone with a sh in their name, which includes Jesus, has to have it changed to s sound, which they did have. And also, unlike Aramaic, Greek is what we call an inflected language, and both the verbs change according to a lot of things: person, time, tense, so forth, mood. Aramaic sort of does for verbs, but when it comes to nouns, it does not inflect them, whereas Greek does. It has declensions so that there's an ending for a nominative, a vocative, accusative, dative, genitive, ablative. The nouns all change, and that includes personal names. And that means that the names have to have an ending that is recognizable and can be put into different cases. So they not only have to change the sounds of the name, they also have to change the ending of the name. And that's why you end up with a name like Jesus, which is absolutely nothing like the name that he had in Aramaic. So let's talk about that, and then we'll move on to his mother, his father, and the apostles. Now, things will get a little bit complicated as we move along, because we will need to take several journeys through different languages to get to English. Because although the Greek Bible is in Greek, it got translated into Latin, which was the common language for church usage in ancient times in the Middle Ages, well, down to the 1960s, in fact, if you were Catholic. And then the Latin got translated into English. So there's a lot of changes that got made along the way, but I mostly want to stick with the Aramaic to Greek, because that's the big change. The change from Greek to Latin is kind of minor in a way, because they've got roughly the same alphabets and roughly the same sound systems, and Latin to English a little bit complicated, but anyway. With Jesus, I will do the whole thing, and then later with Paul I'll talk about an interesting quirk. But let's start with Jesus. In Aramaic, his name was Yeshua, and it was a common name, and was the Aramaic version of the Hebrew for what we now use for Joshua. Right? You can hear it like Yeshua, Joshua, yeah, pretty much the same. And his epithet in the Bible was HaMashiach, which means the Messiah. And Messiah literally means anointed, so it means a king, really, because he's anointed with holy oil at his coronation. The Greek for Mashiach is Christos, same meaning, anointed with oil. And so we move from Yeshua HaMashiach to Jesus Christ. I mean, no, Christ was not his name. That's an epithet that he was given afterwards. But let's just stick with Yeshua. Yeshua has a couple of problems. The y sound at the beginning doesn't work in Greek, so that had to be given an I. Ye was close to y, so that was all right. And sh had to be changed to s, so yes. And then ua is not a Greek ending. The closest was us, which is a good ending for adding the nominative, accusative endings and so forth. So in Greek, his name went from Yeshua to Jesus. And you can see where this is going. In Latin, it could also be transliterated as Jesus, although the us became us because that's a Latin ending, like Marcus, similar declension. And then in English, the ye became j. So you go from Jesus to Jesus. And that's how you go from Yeshua to Jesus. I mean, when you put them along in a string, you can see how the changes happened. But if you just start with the Aramaic and end with the English, it seems to be, worlds apart. And it's not. I mean, Jesus' name, Yeshua, was a very common name. And I always remember my mother being very upset when we lived in Argentina, because she said, how can they call little boys Jesus or Jesus? It's like the only person with the name Jesus should be Jesus. Well, I mean, I suppose in some kind of convoluted way that's right, because it's a made-up name and it was made up for him. And of course, in the Anglophone world, we don't normally, call a little boy Jesus, but certainly in Latin America, Jesus is a very common name. So that's how we get from whatever you want to call him, a teacher, and he was known as rabbi, or some variant thereof. How we go from a first century rabbi in Judah called Joshua or Yeshua to this Messiah called Jesus. It's a strange journey. But what I would like to do, if I had the time and a greater inclination, would be to change all of the names in the Greek Testament back into their Aramaic originals, so we get a sense of them as Aramaic people. When you read the Greek or the Latin or the English, you almost get the sense that they're speaking English, because they have names like James and Andrew and Paul, Peter, Simon. I mean, you can imagine going and have a drink with them down at the pub, but their Aramaic names would give you much more of the flavor of where they're located. But I don't think it's going to happen anytime soon. But let's think about. I'm going to use the name Jesus more for humor than anything else. What was Yeshua's parents' names? His father was named Joseph. Joseph is a good Aramaic name. In fact, I was reading recently that Joseph was considered to be a Jewish name until relatively recently in Europe. It's not obviously anymore, but it's a good Hebrew Aramaic name, no problem. But Mary isn't. Like, Mary has nothing to do with Aramaic. Her name was obviously Miriam. So how do you feel, I mean, whether you're Christian or not, about calling her Miriam? It gives to me a closer feeling of who she might have been when she was living in Judah. All right, well, that's what we can call the Holy Family. Now let's expand to his brothers and the apostles, and probably conclude with Paul. I'm not sure. Sort of depends on where my meandering goes. Well, I think perhaps I'll start with the worst of the apostles, if you like, who's called Judas in English and also in Greek. Well, his Aramaic name would have been Judah. And Judah, if you remember your Genesis, was one of the 12 sons of Jacob, and he had a tribe of Judah. And in fact, the tribe of Judah became its own kingdom at one point. There was the kingdom of Israel in the north and the kingdom of Judah centered on Jerusalem in the south. And Judah was made up mostly of members of the tribe of Judah, with also some of the tribe of Benjamin and of Simeon. But the northern tribes, there were approximately 10 of them, made up the kingdom of Israel, which was wiped out completely by the Assyrians in the 8th century BCE. And they're gone. The Assyrians just hauled them off, deported them to other places, and they are no more. They're called, they're sometimes called the lost tribes of Israel. They don't appear in the historical record after that. So Judah, as a kingdom, survived on its own. It was also eventually conquered and people deported to Babylon by Nebuchadnezzar. And subsequently, that's the remnant of all of the tribes, and gives us the name Judah, which also eventually gives us the name Jew. A person who is a Jew now, in theory anyway, I mean obviously the lineages are not possible to define anymore, but Judah in Greek becomes Judaios, which in Latin becomes Judas, and in English becomes Judas. But Judah really just meant at that time a Judean, and it's so Judah was the male version and Judith was the female version. In modern Jewish culture, the name is Yehudi. The original Hebrew for Judah would have been Yehuda, and so that's Judas, and he is distinguished in English from one of the brothers of Jesus, in fact, by being called Jude in English, but his name is the same too. So that's an interesting start. Let's think about Peter. Now, Peter's original name, you may recall, is Simon, and Jesus changed his name to Peter. And if you've seen my last video on the Hebrew Bible, you remember that name changes are very, very important biblically. That when somebody changes their name, they also change their essence. So Peter was originally called Simon, which would have been something like Simeon or Shimon. But and this is really fascinating to me. His name was changed to Kephas in Aramaic, and Kephas means rock. And Paul, in his writings, refers to Peter almost exclusively as Kephas. Kephas in Greek, the meaning of rock or stone, is Petros. And you know that if you know anything like petroglyph. A petroglyph is a carving in rock from archaeology. So Petros translated into Latin into English is Peter. Some simple ones. James is Jacob. Not quite sure how that occurred. That occurred somewhere between Latin and English, because if you look at the Latin names of the kings of England, James is always referred to in Latin as Jacobus. So James the apostle was certainly Jacob, Jacobus, or Yaakov. How Jacob gets to be James a little bit beyond me. I don't understand that one. John was Johanan, and that one's also not too bad. That's and you can see in German Johann and Johannan are fairly close. It's the transliteration into English that makes it John. Now there are a few of the apostles whose names remain pretty close to their Aramaic originals, like Matthew, for example. Matthew in Aramaic is Matityahu. A little bit off, obviously. Yahu is another way of saying Yahweh, which is the name of God. And many, many, many Aramaic names had some form of Yahu in them. So Matityahu becomes Matithios in Greek, shortened to Matthios, which is eventually translated into English as Matthew. The one that really intrigues me is Paul, and that intrigues me on many different levels. Again, if you know your Bible, you'll know that Paul's original name, when he was a member of the Sanhedrin and when he was persecuting Christians, his name was Saul. Saul was, of course, the first king of Israel and Judah, replaced ultimately by David and then David's line. But Saul was the original, and in Aramaic his name is Shaul. Well, sh can't be transliterated into Greek, so he became Saulos. But he also had a name change. And pay attention to name changes. And when he converted, when he had his vision on the road to Damascus and he converted to Christianity, he changed his name to Paul. Didn't change his name to a Greek name, he changed his name to a very common, well-known Latin name, Paulus. Now what that change signifies is that he was identifying with the Roman Empire, which is of course the great enemy. They were the scourge of the Jews. But he's changing his name to a Gentile name because he wants to identify with the Gentile regions of Europe, North Africa, Middle East, and takes a Latin name, which then gets transliterated into Greek as Paulos. So it's a change of one vowel, Paulos, U in Latin, to Paulos in Greek, O. And either way comes down to us as Paul. And I would say that very, very few people who are Christians, even Christian theologians, don't make much of the fact that Shaul, as a member of the Sanhedrin, had a very fiercely Hebrew name with great heritage. He changed it to a Roman name when he converted. That's an amazing transformation, which I don't believe I've ever heard anyone ever talk about that. In fact, it was just something that I happened upon myself a few days ago. So there's the main characters, I guess you'd call them. There are others, of course, and you can look it up for yourselves if you like. But can you imagine a gospel in which we're not talking about Jesus and Mary and Joseph and Peter and James and John, but we're talking about Miriam, Yeshua, Joseph, of course, Yohanan, Kephas, it would give the Gospels a very different feeling. Now, of course, some people will say, well, they need to be globalized, and of course all the names are translated into their common versions in the languages that are spoken. So in German, the names are all German. Spanish, they certainly are. So I suppose that's all right. But I really like the feeling of the original names, because it gives me a sense of the culture out of which they came. And that's something that is completely lost when the names and the Gospels are translated into English. You get the feeling that Jesus spoke English. And in fact, you may have seen memes and so forth talking about how people said things like, if English is good for me because it was good enough for Jesus or whatever. But if we actually put the Gospels into their cultural context, we would understand a lot more than we do when we put them into the context of English speaking. And that's part of what I'm doing in my research right now, is showing how culture matters. And I'll talk about that some other time. Meanwhile, as always, please tell your friends, please like, please subscribe, and ask them to do the same. And I've got a recipe for you. I'm not going to tell you what it is, but I already know, I've already got the ingredients, and it's a carnival recipe from New Orleans coming up Tuesday. Have a good weekend.